The Alabaster, Almanac. Chapter. Neither here nor there, a chapter in two altitudes. Practice makes perfect, said no one who had ever actually watched Sister Clotilde attempt to sit down. Anonymous, scrawled on the inside of a supply closet at Our Lady of Perpetual Bewilderment. A silent day begins, incorrectly. The morning came into the call center the way bad news comes into a doctor's waiting room slowly, with a foggy glow that looked harmless from a distance, and revealed its intentions only once you were already inside it, and the door had clicked shut behind you. The fluorescent lights flickered on at 7:55 a.m. The coffee machine in the break room produced its usual delinquent sputtering. Someone had taped a motivational poster to the wall. Overnight, it said, "Open the door. The future is here, nothing to fear," in a font that suggested whoever designed it had never experienced anything worth fearing, and it hung there above the roster of the day's call schedule, with the cheerful irrelevance of a get-well card at a funeral. Sister Clotilde arrived at 8:02. She came through the glass front door carrying a leather satchel, a travel mug of black coffee, a basket of yarn she had been crocheting from since the previous Thursday, and approximately 1 foot of empty air between the soles of her shoes and the floor. This was already not ideal. The uncontained, everlasting quality of it, the sense that this levitation had no intention of resolving itself like its predecessors had, was what separated this morning from every other. It had an architecture, a driving logic, a knocking quality, like something below the surface of her choosing this, that had been knocking at a door she hadn't known was hers to open. The senior staff, the veterans, the ones who had been working under Clotilde long enough to have developed an institutional vocabulary for the unusual, looked up from their monitors and began exchanging knowing glances with the practiced efficiency of people executing a drill they had rehearsed but hoped never to use. Knowing glances right. Knowing glances left. Concerned glances toward the ceiling, to assess clearance. Concerned glances back at Clotilde, who was walking, or rather, forward floating in a walking motion, her feet going through the sincere physical pantomime of walking while the ground declined to participate toward her office with the expression of a woman who had decided this was temporary and intended to manage it through sheer administrative force of will. "Good morning," Clotilde said to the general floor. "Good morning, Sister Clotilde," said approximately 12 people, as one, because they were professionals. She reached her office. She sat down. The chair rose 2 inches with her. She pressed it back down with both hands and held it there, like a woman arm wrestling with the concept of seated posture. Youngblood appeared in the doorway with the satchel she'd left by the entrance, which she'd dropped when she'd tried to set it on the floor and missed. "You left this," he said. "I'm aware," she said. He looked at her. He looked at the gap between the chair and her. "How long?" "Since approximately 3 in the morning. I woke up on the ceiling." Youngblood processed this the way he processed everything Clotilde related, with the quiet, even-keeled absorption of a man who had accepted, somewhere around his 3rd month on this job, that the parameters of normal employment did not fully apply here. He sat down in the chair across from her desk. He picked up his basket of yarn. He resumed crocheting a small, teal-colored rectangle of uncertain purpose that he had been adding to, an inch at a time, since October, and looked at her with the attentive calm of someone settling in for a situation that required witnessing. "It's worrisome," he said. "It is," she agreed. "On a scale. Very high on the scale. Is it?" He chose the word carefully. "Contagious?" Clotilde looked at him. "I don't know what that question means in this context." "I don't either," he said, "but it seemed worth asking." Outside the glass partition, the call center floor was filling up. New hires, fresh-faced, untested, still in possession of their original expectations, were logging into their terminals and putting on their headsets with the optimistic briskness of people who had not yet learned to read the room. 3 of them glanced over at Clotilde's office. 2 of them looked astonished. One of them, a young woman named Amber, who had been on the job for 4 days and was already harboring serious questions about the employee handbook, looked at the floating nun, looked at her monitor, looked at the floating nun again, and then sent a text to someone outside the building that read simply, "So the thing I mentioned is happening again." She felt, at this hour, light years from the coordinates of normal. An orphan of the floor. What on earth was happening to her? The question arrived each time she looked down and saw the clean institutional carpet from an altitude at which it should not be visible, and each time it arrived, she managed it with the same response. "I am fine." This is fine. We are all fine and will continue to be fine until proven otherwise. "You look frazzled," Amber said from below, helpfully. "I look exactly as I should look," Clotilde said. For a woman who has been awake since 3 a.m. and is currently tackling a significant gravitational anomaly while managing a 42-person call center operation, a lobotomy would look worse than this. "Please return to your terminal." Clotilde set her travel mug on the desk. It floated a 1/4 inch above the surface, then settled. She pushed it flat with one finger. "It's going to be fine," she said, to no one in particular. "Of course," Youngblood said, pulling his yarn through the hook. "Temporary situation. Absolutely." Man of the cloth, woman of the cloth. She straightened her habit with the authority of someone calling a meeting to order. "This is neither here nor there. We have 42 calls scheduled before noon, a staff meeting at 2, and a special delivery coming from the diocesan office at 11. I am not going to allow a minor gravitational irregularity to compromise the operations of this facility." She stood up from the chair, floated to 18 inches, grabbed the desk edge, and pulled herself back to 12. 12 inches, she said. "I can work at 12 inches. 12 inches is accessible. 12 is very manageable," Youngblood said. "I once gave an entire Ash Wednesday address from an altitude of 4 feet, Clotilde said. "Nobody noticed until the recessional." "This is nothing." The phones began to ring. Sister Clotilde answered hers with the composed authority of a woman who had decided that the harsh truth of the morning was simply going to have to wait in the hall. Tilda, tilda, tilda. By 10 o'clock, she was at 14 inches. This was noted by the floor in the way the floor noted all of Clotilde's increments quietly, through a complex and entirely nonverbal system of concerned glances and small adjustments. The temp workers nearest to her office had begun the subtle process of moving any objects of consequence away from the path she might travel, in the manner of people clearing a runway for an aircraft whose landing gear was under investigation. Amber from the new hires had stopped being astonished and had moved into the more comfortable territory of fascinated, which was a more sustainable place to be. She was already planning to go to any salon in Hammond on her next day off and process this employment experience with someone who held scissors. The cash box for the weekly collection on Clotilde's credenza began vibrating slightly whenever she passed. Nobody mentioned it. Youngblood brought her a second coffee at 10:30, which required a small logistical negotiation. As she was hovering at the level of his collar, and the natural dynamics of handing a mug to someone floating above you created a brief period of mutual awkwardness before they worked it out. "Have you called Dorothea?" he said. "No." "Have you called anyone?" "I sent a letter of resignation to Gravity at approximately 4 this morning. It did not reply." He looked at her. "That's a Dear John letter, not a resignation." "Same energy," she said. "Sister Clotilde." He held the mug up toward her, the steam rising between them. "This is getting to be past the level of a spiritual retreat kind of situation. This is getting to be past the mop handle and zip ties phase. You tried the mop handle earlier," she pointed out. "You cleared it by 3 inches. I am aware of how high I cleared it, Youngblood. I was there. And the zip ties lifted the chair. Then the chair lifted the filing cabinet. Then the filing cabinet knocked over the plant, which hit the window, and we have said enough about the zip tie phase. Clotilde took the coffee from him. She held it in both hands and looked at the floor that had been her floor, had been any floor. For 53 years, with the expression of a woman recalling something she had taken for granted, and was only now, in its absence, understanding the specific, irreplaceable value of, "It will pass," she said. "What if it doesn't?" "Then it will be outrageous, and we'll deal with it." She sipped the coffee. "Go back to your crocheting, young blood. Don't look at me like that." "Like what?" "Like I'm walking around in circles." "I'm not walking around in circles. I'm floating in a fixed position with excellent posture and full professional competency. And that's the truth of it. And I need you to reflect that truth back at me, rather than the other available truths." Youngblood looked at her for a moment. "For Jules." He said the thing he said sometimes when he was offering something up, some silent dedication to the deceased cousin he'd lost the previous spring. The phrase that meant, "This one's carried in care," not just said. Clotilde looked at him. Something in her expression softened. "Go back to your crocheting," she said, more quietly. He went. The second. Gumbo at the shop right. A study in seeing red. Gumbo had a roster. He did not call it a shopping list. He called it a roster because a list suggested randomness, and a roster suggested a team, a curated assembly of ingredients selected with intention and deployed toward a common purpose, which was, in his view, exactly what cooking was. His roster for the day was written in his tight, characterful hand on the back of a Kwanzaa card from 2 years ago, that he'd kept because the design was good. Collard greens, dried red beans, a good burger's worth of ground beef for the baby, cornmeal, and a lemon for the sweet tea that Dorothea had been asking about since Tuesday. The shop right on Marcel Avenue was not Gumbo's preferred grocery. He preferred Thibaud's on the west side, which had better produce and a deli counter, staffed by a woman named Renata, who had been giving him slightly more generous portions for 6 years, and who he regarded with warm reciprocal appreciation. But Thibaud's was closed on Wednesdays for inventory, and the roster was not a suggestion. He made his way through the store with the unhurried deliberateness of a 91-year-old man who had nowhere better to be and nothing to prove to the pace of the world. Past the end-cap display of cotton candy and gummy things. Past the dried goods aisle where a man in a leather vest was on a phone call so loud and so aggressive that other shoppers were executing small quiet deviations away from his radius. Past the bread aisle, which smelled like something sublime and made him nostalgic for his mother's kitchen in a way that was sudden and particular and entirely his own. He passed the seasonal display Kwanzaa decorations still up on one side, Valentine's Day going up on the other, the retail calendar marrying holidays together in a continuous frowning rush toward the next commercial occasion. 2 teenagers stood at the Valentine's display, the boy turning a card over in his hands with the solemn deliberateness of someone for whom this was a very significant decision. "Young love." Gumbo smiled. He had been that boy once, in another century, in another world. He had been over the moon about a girl from Slidell named Celestine who had, in her wisdom, declined his attentions and married a dentist. He'd been better for it. Eventually, he noticed the man in the leather vest still on his phone. Now in the canned goods aisle, palmed something from his jacket into a cart, glancing around with the performed casualness of someone who believed he was being subtle, and was not, a small package. The transaction had the texture of suspicion, that particular shift in a person's body language that happens when they know they're doing something under the table, and the knowledge is louder than they think. The cart was left, a moment later, at the end of the aisle. Another man retrieved it. Unmarked bills had a sound in this world. Gumbo had learned not literal, but a register, a frequency, the frequency of something that didn't want to be followed. He looked at neither of them knowingly. He kept moving. He was not the kind of man who inserted himself into things that weren't his. He had a roster. He had beans to make. He was standing at the meat counter, reading the label on a package of ground beef, when the man appeared beside him. White man, mid-50s. The kind of mid-50s that had been comfortable long enough to have stopped monitoring its own behavior. He stood next to Gumbo and waited for the counter attendant. And then he said it, not in the voice of someone making a declaration. Not loudly, but in the conversational tone of someone saying a thing they've said before and expected no consequence for. Black is cold, huh? Gumbo did not move. He kept his eyes on the label. The label said 85% lean. He thought about that for a moment, 85% of anything still being mostly the thing, still carrying the weight and the name of the thing even with 15% of something else inside it. He put the package down, quiet as a mouse. He turned. The man had the expression of someone who had already decided this was nothing, that it was just a thing said. A nothing thing said to a nothing person in a nothing moment that would evaporate before he reached his car. Gumbo looked at him. He was seeing red, but the red was deep and old and had been refining itself for 9 decades into something very precise, not hot, not explosive, but exact. The kind of red that does not shout. The kind that simply stands in front of you and looks at you until you understand what you've done. Beg your pardon? Gumbo said. The man blinked. Come again, Gumbo said. Same tone. Low. Even. The voice of a man who had been in places the other man would never understand, who had carried things the other man had never been asked to carry, and who was now standing in the meat aisle on a Wednesday, being addressed as though he were ambient, as though he were weather. The man opened his mouth, closed it. Under the table, Gumbo said, with the same calm, is where cowardice lives. You said what you said. Don't go under the table now that someone heard it. Silence. A suspended moment. The kind that stretches between two people in a public space and fills up with everything that's true about the situation. The counter attendant, a young man named Devonte, who had been watching from behind the glass case with wide-eyed stillness of someone who had just walked into a scene midway through its most important line, said nothing, because there was nothing to say. This was between these two men and the truth of the moment. The man in the mid-50s walked away, not in a hurry. With the specific unhurried pace of a person who has decided to remove themselves from a situation while trying to look like the removal was voluntary and not a retreat. Gumbo watched him go. He picked up the package of ground beef. He put it in his basket. He stood in the aisle for a long moment alone in it. That particular solitude that comes after a thing has been said, and the saying of it has rearranged something in the air, and he let the moment pass through him the way all the moments of his life had passed through him, fully, without trying to dam them up, because he had learned a long time ago that the floodwaters of a life were better navigated than resisted. He finished his shopping. He did not mention it when he got home. He put the groceries away. He started the beans. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at his wrists for a long time. The third. The discovery at the chapel pond, a matter of public record. The woods behind Our Lady of Perpetual Bewilderment had, on this particular Wednesday, a quality that chaos would later describe as deeply uncharted, meaning that despite the fact that he had walked this path 40 or 50 times since coming to live on the convent grounds, the woods had decided today to present a different version of themselves, one with more fog, more bird noise, more of that particular Louisiana density that made the air feel like something you were moving through rather than breathing. He had gone out to walk because baby Germaine was napping. Dorothea was occupied with the ironing situation that was apparently her perennial response to any ambient anxiety, and the convent grounds had the lingering quiet of a place that was between events, that blooming, not yet tainted interval between one strange thing and the next. He heard it before he saw it. A sound. Coming from the direction of the chapel of the perpetual rustling. A sound that was difficult to categorize, because it was operating in a frequency range that existed somewhere between crooning, belching, and what Chaos could only describe as a very committed howl. It was not painful to hear. It was not pleasant. It was the sound of something experiencing a specific altered consciousness and narrating the experience to the available trees. He walked toward it. The chapel's clearing came into view, through the last stand of live oaks. And what Chaos saw there caused him to stop walking and stand very still for approximately 10 seconds, while his brain processed the information at whatever speed it was capable of processing information of this specific nature. Janet was at the pond. This was normal. Janet was always at the pond. What was not normal was the setup around Janet. In the time centuries, surely that Janet had occupied this space. The pond's surroundings had maintained the aesthetic of ancient, deliberate simplicity. Moss-covered rocks, the chapel wall, the old wood of the dock, the lily pads, the ambient evidence of a creature who needed very little because she expected very little. The setup today included a small folding table made of what appeared to be wicker furniture. Where she had obtained this, from whom, and at what price were questions Chaos added to his growing mental file labeled questions I am not asking today. On the table. A glass pipe, a small lighter of the disposable gas station variety, a crinkled square of aluminum foil, and a jar of something that was not labeled but whose fumes were reaching Chaos from 20 feet away, and producing in him the distinct sensation of having driven too fast over a speed bump he didn't see. She was not, currently, in good shape. The meth, and there was no other word for it, and there was no softer frame for it, had her in the hooked, total, categorical way that these things had people when they had been given an opening. The bath salts had been the opening. The meth had walked through it. She was crouching at the shallow end of the pond. And her body was a body aching in all directions at once: the knees, the wrists, the places where the track marks were, the moon crater face pulled tight by dehydration from a drought of sensible fluid intake that had lasted approximately 3 weeks. She had been screaming earlier. Chaos hadn't known that he'd only caught the howling, the I'm fandango phase, the relatively composed tail end of a much longer event. But earlier, before the sunrise, there had been a different phase. The weeping, the shrieking at nothing, the moaning that had no object, the shaking that had no name. There had been a period of vomiting near the eastern bank that she had tried to cover with leaves. There had been a period of begging, not at Chaos, not at Gumbo, not at any specific entity, but at the general arrangement of existence. Please, 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 in the pleading, puckered, bowing at the neck way of a creature, making an appeal with nothing left to offer. There had been shouting. There had been, at one particularly difficult 4 a.m. hour, a weeny little sound from the back of her throat that she refused to identify, but which was the sound of something breaking. The crunching of leaves under Chaos's feet arriving had stopped all of it. She'd heard him coming from far out. She had very good hearing for a slime troll, and had arranged herself into something she hoped read as conducting a ritual, rather than in the middle of a full crisis in the sunroof of my own misery. It had not entirely worked. Chaos stood at the edge of the clearing in total disbelief, not the performed kind, not the kind that required an audience, but the private kind. The interior kind that a person experiences when reality presents them with something their brain is genuinely struggling to file. He looked at the setup. He looked at Janet. He looked at the Xbox still in its packaging. "One time," Janet said, in the voice of someone who had told themselves this at least 40 times. "I was going to do it one time." Also on the table, an Xbox controller, still in its packaging, unopened. A zipped-up bag of what appeared to be sandwich materials. And, inexplicably, in the truest sense of that word, a dildo. standing upright against the wicker table leg like a conceptual sculpture with an agenda. Chaos was not going to interrogate. Janet was not at the table. Janet was in the shallow end of the pond, standing waist-deep, arms spread, head tilted back, howling at the tree canopy in the key of something that had no name in Western music. "Open the door!" Janet shouted at the sky. "The future is here. Nothing to fear." She turned. She saw chaos. There was a long moment. A genuine, extended, deafening silence that poured itself into the clearing, like something that had been under pressure. "I'm Fandango," Janet said. Chaos looked at her. He looked at the table. He looked at the Xbox still in its packaging. He looked back at Janet. "Are you?" he started. "This," Janet said, with the specific, dignified composure of a creature who has been caught doing something and has decided the best response is to reframe the entire situation as nobody's business, "is a spiritual practice, centuries old. The tryst between the self and the void." She lowered her arms. She slid her hair floating wild and tangled around her head, a full ecosystem of knots and pond residue out of her face. Her moon-crater cheeks were flushed a deep, luminous pink beneath the usual layer of algae. Her eyes were tracking two separate trees. "You are not here," she informed him. "I very much am, Chaos said. "You are a breadcrumb," Janet said. "That the universe has left for itself. A goblin of context. A gobble of irrelevant information. You are lost as a goose in fog, and I am not receiving you." "Janet, are you smoking meth?" "I am performing an uncharted ritual," Janet said, beginning to wade toward shore with the dignity of a woman who has been confronted with a harsh truth and intends to walk past it without eye contact. "That has nothing to do with what you just said." She emerged from the water. The Fredericks of Hollywood slip clung to her. She sat down on a mossy rock and put her face in her hands. Chaos came closer. He looked at her arms. There, below the wrist in the soft gray skin of an entity who had not historically been associated with any chemical dependency, because historically the available chemicals had been fish and rainwater, were track marks. He sat down on the dock. "How long?" he said. "Neither here nor there," Janet said, from behind her hands. "It is very specifically here and there, Janet. Those are track marks. Tainted circumstances," she said. "Worrisome situation. The bath salts incident last month disrupted the underground water, and I was exposed to residual fumes for 4 days before it cleared." She looked up. Her bulbous eyes were reddened, which on Janet produced an effect that could most accurately be compared to a very old, very tired traffic light in a bad neighborhood. One thing led to another. "That's not you can't." Chaos searched for the right framing. He was 17, or somewhere in the young adult range that felt like 17. And he had seen enough of the world's troublesome arrangements to know that the secret ingredient of addiction was never what people thought it was. It was never the substance. It was whatever the substance was standing in front of. "What were you burying?" he said. Janet looked at him for a long time. "The malt shop contamination," she said finally. "I was wrong about how well I'd recovered. The underground water damage got into the freshwater system, and I absorbed some of it, and it left she waved a hand, a residue, a pharmaceutical residue, and I was tired. Chaos. I have been the guardian of this basin for 600 years. 600 years. And nobody from that convent," she pointed through the trees, "has ever once brought me so much as a casserole. Not for Kwanzaa. Not for anything. I am sitting out here like some kind of enigmatic, rebellious goblin with cotton for company, and a poor man's version of Kathy Bates' energy, and the antibiotic they gave me for the pond infection in March was not sufficient, and—" She stopped. She belched. Copiously. "Excuse me," she said. "It's okay. I was fibbing earlier," she said. "About the ritual. It is not a ritual. It is a problem.
Yeah, Chaos said. I figured.
I have been carrying this on the down low, Janet said. Like Harriet Tubman. Except Harriet Tubman was moving people toward freedom. And I was moving myself toward a pond. With a pipe and a wicker table. And an Xbox I cannot even operate. Because I don't have the right thumbs. She looked at the controller still in its packaging. I bought it because I thought it would give me something to look forward to. I cannot explain the dildo. I want to be clear that the dildo arrived independently of my decision-making. Nobody's asking about the dildo, Chaos said. Good, Janet said. Chaos looked at the fumes still drifting from the glass pipe on the table. He looked at the pond, clear and restored since Anna's intervention. Its freshwater surface catching the midday light in small, honest flashes. He thought about the nefarious dealings in the underground world that had started this, the bath salts. The drain, the pharmaceutical cascade that had arrived in Janet's home uninvited. She hadn't chosen the initial exposure. That was true. He understood that architecture. The architecture of something arrives in your system, and then the wanting of it outlasts the reason for it. Beware the path, he said, not lecturing, just saying it, the way Gumbo said things sometimes. Not performing wisdom, just placing it down like a rock on a table. The one that starts with somebody else's decision and ends up being yours. Janet looked at the pond for a long time. Declare yourself, she said quietly, to the water, not to Chaos. To herself.
I'm going to get Dorothea, Chaos said.
No, not Dorothea. She'll bring a pantsuit. Janet stood up. She had the shaking, body-aching quality of a creature in a transition, not dramatic, not crumbling. Just the particular physical honesty of something coming back to itself from somewhere far away. Give me 1 hour. I want to put the table away and take the Xbox back. And she looked at the dildo. Deal with that. Where are you even taking it back to? Chaos said. Janet didn't answer. She began gathering things from the wicker table with the quiet, methodical care of someone taking down the evidence of a life chapter they are choosing not to continue. The fourth. Things escalate, as they do. Back at the call center, Clotilde had reached 2 feet. This was flabbergasting to the new employees, impossible for the veterans to process as anything other than a familiar escalation, and deeply troubling to the structural integrity of the afternoon schedule. At 2 feet, she could no longer sit at her desk without the logistics of it, becoming a continuous, low-grade combatant situation. The chair, the floor, and the laws of physics, all engaged in a four-way dispute that was producing neither a winner nor a consensus. She had given up on the chair. She was floating at desk level in a standing position, which required her to look slightly downward at her computer screen, and gave the whole scene the appearance of a woman conducting an aerial inspection of her own workspace. I need you to send the 11 o'clock emails, she told Youngblood, who was doing this already. Done, he said. And the diocesan delivery when it arrives. Please receive it. And do not mention to the diocesan representative that I am. She gestured at herself, at the air around her feet, at the general situation. In a meeting, Youngblood offered. In a meeting, she agreed. He went to the window, looked down at the parking lot. Chaos just called. There's a situation at the pond. Clotilde closed her eyes. Janet.
Sounds like it.
Of course. She pressed her palms together over her chest, the motion of a woman collecting herself for something. The motion produced a very slight upward acceleration. She stabilized at 2 feet 3 inches. Is she all right? Chaos says she's ambulatory. And remorseful. And apparently the Xbox is still in its packaging, which he seemed to think was a positive sign. It means the depth of the problem hasn't reached its full floor yet, Clotilde said. If the Xbox was open, we'd be past the turning point. She floated to the window and looked out. Below her, through the glass, the parking lot shimmered in the midday heat. She's been out there all alone for a very long time. She chose to be out there, Youngblood said. Everybody who ends up alone chose something that started differently. That's the perennial truth of isolation. Nobody walks out there and says, I will now spend centuries becoming impossible to reach. They just walk one step further from the path each time. Each step reasonable. Each step explained to themselves in a language that sounds like self-sufficiency, but is actually just loneliness with better posture. Youngblood looked at her. She was now at 2 feet 6 inches, hovering by the window with her hands clasped and her habit hanging straight down, and her face turned toward the tree line in the distance. And she looked not frightening, not funny, not strange, exactly. She looked like someone being carried by something she couldn't name. Like someone who had been walking so long she'd forgotten she'd started walking. And now, the walking had become something else entirely. Sister Clotilde, he said. You're at 2'6".
I know.
At what point does this become? He paused, searched for the right category. Legally insane. It cannot be legally insane, she said.
It has a theological classification.
It is called levitation, and it is documented in 17 separate cases in the annals of the Church, and I am not unique in experiencing it. I am unique only in... She looked at the ceiling, the frequency, and the duration, and the involuntary nature, and the... She stopped. It's getting worse, Youngblood. I know. It's been getting worse all morning. At this rate, by 3 o'clock. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. They both looked at the ceiling. The ceiling was 9 feet up. She was at 2.5, and climbing. She had reached 3 feet by 12.30. At 3 feet, the situation became out of this world in a way that even the veteran's institutional vocabulary could not fully accommodate. Someone on the floor, a man named Dale, who had been there 11 years, and had seen things, muttered, quietly, to his monitor. This is the one. He had the frown of a man marrying 2 incompatible realities and being made to attend the reception. She was, at 3 feet, tuning in to something. That was the only way she could describe it internally, a frequency becoming clearer as she rose. A leftover signal she'd been too close to the ground to receive. Something in the architecture of the air at this altitude that resonated with the part of her that was, against all the traditions of her profession, already tilted toward whatever came next. Tilda. At 1:15 p.m., Clotilde walked into the main conference room for the staff briefing. There were 40 people in that room. 40 people. The specific count mattered because what happened next required a critical mass to be truly incomprehensible. 40 people. Call center staff, a liaison from the diocesan office who had arrived early with a briefcase and the look of baseline concern that was about to be revised significantly. 3 summer interns, the building's HVAC technician who had come about the ductwork and been told to wait, and a woman named Maureen from accounting who came to every meeting 15 minutes early and sat in the same corner chair and ate a granola bar with a focused, methodical pleasure that suggested she'd been looking forward to it since the previous Thursday. When Clotilde came through the door floating at 32 inches, in full habit, carrying her notepad and her rosary, and the lingering authority of a woman who had managed this facility for 19 years and had no intention of being defined by her altitude, every single one of those 40 people turned at the same exact time and smiled at her. The gown of her vocation, the habit, the cross, the pendant, the whole accumulated weight of 53 years of mighty self-control was not keeping her down today. The chains of discipline that had served as anchors all her life were either not attached or were, somehow, also rising. That is the sentence as it happened. 40 people, same exact time, turn and smile. Not in sequence. Not individually. Not in the way that a wave of acknowledgement moves through a room when someone enters, simultaneously. As one face, distributed. as a single expression, reproduced 40 times across 40 different physiognomies at the same instant. It was, Youngblood would later say, the most unsettling thing he had witnessed in 3 years on these grounds. And he had once watched a parrot deliver a 40-minute lecture on the epistemology of flight while standing in a bowl of soup, not a normal room greeting smile. Not the kind of smile that emerges when an acknowledged, respected authority figure enters a space. This was a suspended smile, a momentary, collective, simultaneous smile that crossed 40 different faces at the same precise instant, with the uniformity of a synchronized event. 40 mouths and 40 sets of eyes, producing the same expression at the same moment, as though someone had pressed a button. It lasted approximately 2 seconds. Then everyone looked at the agenda in front of them. Clotilde floated to the head of the mahogany table and set down her notepad. "Good afternoon," she said. "Good afternoon," said 40 people, apparently unconcerned. She looked around the room. She looked at the 40 faces, now attending to their agendas with varying degrees of authentic engagement. The diocesan liaison had the expression of a man who was combatant with his own composure, fighting it, winning narrowly. The HVAC technician looked like he'd stopped being surprised by anything the moment he walked onto the grounds of Our Lady of Perpetual Bewilderment and had made a practical peace with that decision. Amber from the new hires was texting under the table, which Clotilde could see perfectly from 32 inches, because at 32 inches the geometry of a conference table became completely transparent. "Amber," Clotilde said. "Yes, Sista Clotilde. Whatever you're communicating right now, please do it out loud. We are a unity here." Amber put the phone away. The diocesan liaison raised his hand. He was a compact man in a gray suit, who had the look of someone who had been to seminary, specifically because it seemed like a stable career, and was now deep enough in the vocation to be unable to recall where the stability had appeared in the contract. "Sister," he said, and then stopped, as though he had the rest of the sentence but needed to think about whether delivering it was in his interest. "Yes, Marcus," Clotilde said. "Are you currently—" He made a gesture with his hand, indicating the air between her shoes and the floor. "The meeting," Clotilde said, "will address the following items. First, the Q3 call volume review. Second, the staffing proposal for the new intake line. Third, the outstanding matter of the water damage in the supply closet, which is connected to a broader underground situation that we are addressing." She looked around the table. "If anyone has questions about my altitude, please hold them until the end of the agenda. I can't guarantee I'll still be at this altitude by then, but I will address the questions regardless of where I am in the room." "Faithfully noted," said Youngblood, writing this down. V. Janet begins the process. IT is painful, and IT is hers. Chaos brought Gumbo to the pond at 2 p.m. Chaos had drawn a rough chalk arrow on the path into the woods, not for himself, since he'd been twice, but for Gumbo, whose wrists were oriented correctly, but whose eyesight in the tree shadows was not what it once was. Gumbo arrived, looked at Janet, who was sitting on her mossy rock in her stained, leftover Fredericks of Hollywood slip, arms wrapped around her knees, preening a strand of her tangled hair with the distracted focus of someone doing something small, because the large thing is too large to do all at once, and said, "Well, don't," Janet said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were going to say something wise." "I was going to say well, which I already said. It has the architecture of wisdom. I don't want wisdom right now. I want—" She stopped. Her voice had the terrible quality of something genuinely crumbling at its foundations, not dramatic, not performed, but actual. The actual sound of a thing that has been very old and very alone for a very long time, and has, today, finally reached its breaking point. "I want someone to see it," she said. "That's all. Just see it. The wounds. The whole—" She looked at the pond. The whole terrible mess of it. Gumbo came and sat on the rock beside her. He was 91 years old, and he had been sitting next to things that were hard to sit next to for most of his life. And he had learned that the most important quality in that practice was not wisdom, and not words, but just the body. Just the body being there, warm and old and not going anywhere. "I see it," he said. Janet didn't say anything. She put her face back in her hands. She made a sound that was not weeping, but was the thing that lives immediately before weeping, that high, involuntary, puckered sound that a creature makes when it has been not weeping for a very long time. And the body finally overrides the decision. She sobbed. Fully, deeply, without apology, the kind of sobbing that had been storing itself up since long before the meth, since long before the bath salts incident, since long before any of the things that had a name. The crying of something that has been standing alone in a pond for centuries, cataloging everything that passes through the underground water, and having no one to tell about it. The body's aching around her own. The old roots of the live oak she'd been gripping since 2 a.m. The soft trembling of the pond grass at the bank had the quality of a leftover grief that had been waiting, stored in the muscle memory of a very old thing, for the moment when it could finally be discharged. Chaos sat on the dock. He didn't speak. He had enough of his own accumulated crying in him to know that the correct response to someone else's was not commentary. After a while, Janet stopped. She looked at the pond. The freshwater surface moved in small, sun-caught ripples. A dragonfly blew, impractical, exquisite, tuned its wings above the lily pad in that preening, self-correcting way dragonflies moved, like tiny creatures mid-practice of a practice that would never be perfect. "Practice makes perfect," Janet said, in a different voice, quieter, not ironic, just saying something true that she was remembering. "Yeah," Chaos said. "I haven't been practicing anything but hiding," she said. "The thing I am, the guardian of the water, the basin, the whole underground system, I've been maintaining it. But maintaining isn't the same as caring. Maintaining is the opposite of caring, sometimes. Maintaining is just making sure the machinery runs. Caring is..." She looked at Gumbo. "What is caring?" "Showing up," Gumbo said. "Even when you're the one who needs it." She looked at her track marks. She looked at the table, where she'd put the pipe away, and folded the foil, and stacked everything in a small, sorry pile. "Home is where the heart is," she said. And it sounded, in her voice, like the first time those words had ever actually meant the thing they said. Like she was saying them from inside their actual meaning, not as a recited pleasant nothing. She looked at the pond. "This is my home. I'd forgotten I had one. I'd turned it into a workstation." "You can have both," Chaos said. Apparently not without methamphetamine entering the picture. "That was the bath salts." "The bath salts opened the door," Janet said. "The meth was me choosing to keep going through it. There's a distinction. I'm not interested in fibbing about that distinction." Gumbo nodded. He was quiet as a mouse, as he could be when the situation called for it, that quality he had of becoming very still and very present simultaneously, which was its own kind of gift. "What do you want to do?" he said. Janet looked at the table. She looked at the pond. She looked at Chaos, who was 17 or 20 or however old he was, and who had been carrying his own floodwaters, his dead girl, his living son, his telekinetic body full of contained lightning, with a grace that Janet had been watching from the pond for 2 years and had never told him she'd noticed. "I want to get some help," Janet said. "I don't know what that looks like for a slime troll. I assume there's no church group with a roster that covers my specific category. No happy basket of yarn intervention. No special delivery of pamphlets that applies to..." She indicated herself, generally. The algae, the slip, the moon crater face, the independent axis eyes. "I'll ask around," Gumbo said. "You'll ask nobody," Janet said. You'll handle it on the down low. Like Harriet Tubman. You understand the assignment. Harriet Tubman was moving people toward freedom, Gumbo said, with the serene delivery of a man who had been waiting for the right moment to say this. Not managing their secrecy. You understand the assignment, Janet said, firmly. Yes, ma'am, Gumbo said. VI. The crescendo. Which is not metaphorical. At 3:47 p.m., Sister Clotilde reached 4 feet. This was the altitude at which things became operationally problematic in a way that could no longer be managed by vocabulary, good posture, or the collective decision of everyone in the call center to behave as though nothing unusual was happening. At 4 feet, she was above the tops of the cubicle dividers. She could see the entire floor from her position in a way that was technically good for management oversight and terrible for everything else. The phones were still ringing. She was still answering some of them, pressing the headset against her ear and maintaining the brisk, accessible professionalism she had deployed for 19 years, but at 4 feet, floating in slow horizontal circles above the work floor like the world's most devout ceiling fan. The professionalism was doing a lot of heavy lifting. You have reached Our Lady of Perpetual Bewilderment Call and Support Center, she said, into the headset. How may I direct? She drifted toward the window. Your call? Youngblood was tracking her from below with a mop handle, which he was using not to pull her down. He had abandoned that ambition, but as a gentle directional guide, nudging her away from the sharp corner of the filing cabinet, redirecting her drift from the window, keeping her in the center of the room with the calm, focused attention of someone very gently herding a cloud. I'm calling Dorothea, he said. Don't, she said. Sister Clotilde, you are 4 feet off the floor. You are crowing at the ceiling tiles, and you are walking around in circles at an altitude that, by my estimate, will become the height of the ceiling in approximately 45 minutes. I am not crowing. What would you call the sound you were making earlier? She paused. She floated a half-inch upward while pausing. I was singing. It was a processional. It was under my breath. It woke up the people on the 4th floor of the adjacent building. That is an exaggeration, Amber cried. Amber is emotionally turned on by anything above 40 decibels. It's a documented sensitivity. Clotilde looked at the ceiling. She looked at it the way she'd been looking at it all day, not with fear, exactly, but with a specific recognition that the ceiling and she were going to come to a reckoning eventually, and the reckoning was beginning to schedule itself without her input. She thought about shackles, about all the things that were supposed to anchor a person to the earth, and whether any of them actually did. Her vows. The weight of her habit. The mop handle that Youngblood was using to guide her from below, which she appreciated more than she'd told him. The crochet deal rectangle, which she'd brought to work every day this week, and added an inch to each time something happened, and which had now reached approximately the length of a small scarf, and which she thought of, absurdly, as some kind of measurable record of the days. He was crocheting their time together into something useful. She found this, in ways she couldn't fully articulate, deeply faithful. Youngblood, she said. Here. If I... She stopped. She gathered herself. If the situation progresses beyond what is manageable inside this building, I want you to know that everything I know about running this operation is in the blue binder on the credenza, and in your head, and in the accumulated good sense of the people on this floor, who have been doing this work faithfully for years. You don't need me to be on the floor to continue. You've never needed that. You've just needed the permission to proceed without it, and I am giving you that permission now. Youngblood looked up at her. His face had, in the course of this very long day, moved through astonishment, concern, determination, and arrived at something that was quieter and more serious than all of those, the expression of someone receiving something important and knowing it. For Jules, he said. For Jules, she said. She drifted upward. 5 feet. She prayed. Not in the performative sense, not the praying of people who pray for an audience, but the real kind, the inner, continuous, murmuring kind. The kind that didn't have words so much as a direction, a leaning. She had been leaning in this direction since she was 9 years old and had never found a reason to lean elsewhere. She reached the ceiling at 4:33 p.m. This time it was not like the time before, the slow, manageable hover that had resolved itself after 8 hours. This time the ceiling was not a destination but a continuation. She pressed her palms flat against the tile above her and felt the building resist her, and then felt herself resist the building. And then, in the deafening silence of a moment that was either miraculous or catastrophic or both, and had stopped caring about the distinction she went through. Not violently, not dramatically, not with the shattering of tiles and the showers of plaster that the word through might imply. She went through the ceiling the way a thought goes through a mind at 3 a.m. Not breaking anything, leaving everything technically intact, but undeniably, irrevocably, through. She was on the roof. Below her, through the gap she'd made in the ceiling, which was not, on examination, a gap at all. The tiles were intact. The structure was intact. She had apparently simply passed through material reality the way light passes through glass, leaving no wound, no cream smear of evidence, no structural damage, only the fact of her absence, where her presence had been below her. She could hear the deafening silence of the call center floor, processing the fact of her departure. And she was crying. She was singing. She was praying. She was in a mild, high-altitude panic that she was managing through the long practice of faith, which was, she had always believed, less a feeling than a discipline, not the absence of fear, but the continuing choice to move in spite of it. She looked down at Bayou San Mir, at Main Street, where the malt shop's closed sign was being flipped by someone inside the glass. At the convent grounds, visible at the edge of her sight, the tower yellow of the pale house, catching the late afternoon light. At the tree line, where the chapel stood in its perpetual accidental posture. At everything she had organized her life around for 19 years, spread out below her like a love letter written in geography. The wind was already moving. "Oh," Sister Clotilde said, and then the wind took her. It was not a rough wind. It was the dumb, overwhelming, outrageous, sublime force of something that had been building all day, gathering in the Everglades miles south, coming north along the drainage channels and the river roads, building its velocity through the corridor of the trees, arriving at the roof of Our Lady of Perpetual Bewilderment's call center with the timing of something that had an appointment. She went up. She went up through the afternoon sky with the speed of a woman being carried by something much larger than herself, the habit streaming out behind her, the rosary whipping in the wind like a signal flag, the basket of yarn which she had, inexplicably, been holding unspooling beneath her in a long teal thread that described her trajectory across the air, in a color young blood would later be able to follow like a breadcrumb trail across the Louisiana sky. She was praying. She was crying. She was singing. She was, at a certain altitude she would not be able to later identify, also laughing, not a happy laugh, not a funny laugh, but the laugh of someone for whom all other responses have been used, and this is the only one remaining. The laugh of a woman who had spent her entire adult life practicing the discipline of staying, and had now, against all that practice, been sent. She cleared the county line at approximately 5:08 p.m. The 7th. The finding, Tangipaho Parish, approximately 5:21 p.m. A church group from the Immaculate Heart of the Palms in Hammond had been having their Wednesday evening picnic in the meadow off Highway 22. When the woman landed, she did not so much land as descend specifically. A gradual, wobbling descent that reduced in velocity over the final 30 feet, as though whatever had been carrying her had set her down with reasonable care. She arrived in the meadow grass in a standing position, both feet together, habit completely destroyed. A single teal thread attached to her right wrist, trailing back across the sky. toward a direction that was south-southwest and which none of them could see the end of. She stood in the meadow. The church group 17 adults, 4 teenagers, a toddler in a wagon, and the pastor named Brother Gerald, who had been setting out the potato salad, looked at her. She looked at them. "Where is this?" she said, in the voice of someone whose coordinates had been fundamentally rearranged. "Tangipahawa Parish," Brother Gerald said. She looked at the sky. She looked at the grass. She looked at her hands, at the teal thread, at the rosary, at the wounds on her palms that the stigmata had left in their recent irregular appearances. She touched the grass with one finger, as though confirming it was real. "I was in my office," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Brother Gerald said, with the pastoral serenity of a man committed to being helpful regardless of context. "I had a 2 o'clock staff meeting. Ma'am. The Q3 call volume review. I prepared for it. I had the numbers." She sat down in the grass. She sat down the way a person sits when their legs have decided the decision before the brain has finished processing. "I was levitating," she said to the grass. "I have been levitating all day. I couldn't stop." She looked up at the church group, who were arranged in a semicircle with the concerned, attending expression of people who had expected potato salad and were receiving instead a woman in a destroyed habit who had arrived from the sky. "Are you hurt?" a woman in the back said. "I am." Clotilde searched herself. Physically, she was fine. Her body was fine. But something else, the interior architecture of a person who has been removed from everything they know by a force they couldn't resist, was not fine. The shock. The disorientation. The particular mental disturbance that came from being airborne over multiple parishes in your work clothes, crying and praying and laughing and unspooling your companion's crocheted rectangle across the Louisiana sky. "I am somewhat dislodged," she said. "We have a first aid kit," Brother Gerald said. "I don't think this is that kind of situation." He sat down in the grass across from her. He was a large, gentle man with the quality of a person who had been trained specifically for moments that didn't have a protocol. "What's your name?" he said. She thought about this for a moment. Not because she didn't know it. Because the name, and what it was attached to, was still coming back to her through the fog of altitude and motion, and the unprecedented experience of involuntary air travel. "Clotilde," she said. "Sister Clotilde." "Yes." "Can you tell me what parish you're from?" "Our Lady of Perpetual Bewilderment." She looked at him. "BYU St. Mere. That's about 42 miles south of here." "I see. In La Ferque."
Yes.
He looked at her with a quiet, measured concern. "You came from there to here tonight." "I came from there to here," Clotilde said, "via the sky. Against my wishes, but apparently in accordance with something's plan." She looked at the meadow. She looked at the darkening horizon to the south. She thought about Youngblood, who was probably standing on the roof right now, following the teal thread with his eyes. She thought about Dorothea, who would be receiving a phone call shortly, and who would receive it standing with the complete, indestructible composure of a woman who had expected something like this since approximately last Tuesday. She thought about Janet, sitting on her rock at the pond. She thought about chaos on the steps with baby Germaine. She thought about Gumbo, making beans, looking at his wrists. She thought about how home is where the heart is, the true version of that, not the embroidery sampler version. The version that means the people are the place. The place is wherever they are. And she was 42 miles from all of them, and sitting in a church group's picnic meadow in Tangipahoa Parish, with destroyed shoes and a TLA thread on her wrist, and the specific mental disturbance of someone who has just experienced something that had no prior protocol and now needed, very badly, to be brought home. "Could someone," she said, "call me a car?" "We'll drive you," Brother Gerald said. "That's very kind. It's no trouble at all." She looked at him. She looked at the church group, the adults, the teenagers, the toddler in the wagon who was looking at her with enormous, unconcerned eyes, eating a cracker. She thought about how strange and specific human kindness was. How it arrived from directions you didn't expect. How a church group in a meadow in Tangipahawa could be, in the right moment, a kind of heaven's gate, not the terrifying kind, not the destination kind, but the ordinary kind. The kind that just opens and lets you back through toward your life. None otherwise, she said, which was a phrase that meant nothing in standard English, but felt, in that moment, exactly right. I beg your pardon? Brother Gerald said. Nothing, Clotilde said. I'm ready to go home. Tilda. The 8. Afterward, the accounting. Youngblood met her at the door. He had the basket of yarn. He had the look of a man who had spent 2 hours on a roof, and then 2 hours in a parking lot, and was now standing in a doorway at 7:40 p.m., with everything he'd needed to say, organized into a shape that was mostly just relief. The teal thread, Clotilde said. I still have the end of it. I know. I saw it go. He looked at the thread around her wrist. I ran out at the county line. You followed it. As far as it went. She stood in the doorway. She was still in the destroyed habit. She smelled like wind and altitude, and the specific quality of having been somewhere the body wasn't designed to go, and having come back from it anyway. I'm going to need 3 days, she said. I'm going to go to the retreat house in Covington, and I'm going to need 3 days of absolute silence, and as few people as possible. And I want the Reader's Digest the October 1991 issue specifically, the one about the Minnesota composting family, and the plate of something warm. I'll have Dorothea pack it. And Youngblood. Yes. The call center will be fine without me. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man for whom this statement was both true and beside the point. I know it will, he said. I know you know. She looked past him into the building at the dark floor. The empty cubicles. The cash box still on the credenza. The motivational poster above the roster that still said open the door. The future is here. Nothing to fear. She thought about the future. About the 42 miles she'd covered in the sky. About Janet on her rock. About Gumbo's wrists and Chaos's hands and Baby Germain's frequencies and the whole magnificent, troublesome, rebellious thing they were all maintaining together on the edge of this strange town. All of them uncharted, all of them lost as a goose, at least part of the time. All of them somehow finding the path anyway. Good night, Youngblood, she said. Good night, Sister Clotilde, he said. She walked out into the night. She walked on the ground, both feet, all the way down. It was, she decided, the finest feeling she'd had in years.